At my daughter's wedding, my sister raised her glass to the manager, smiled as if she needed something, and then introduced herself as an unemployed woman living away from home. Someone's fork got stuck in their mouth. All the guests at the table looked at me. I laughed. I'd practiced laughing. Then the man sitting next to her gently placed the glass on the cloth, and I saw Sandra's cold smile on her face. Neither of them knew that the man she was trying to impress had been looking for me for 3 years. Welcome to the world of silent drama, where quiet women, sisters, daughters, mothers, are not taken seriously until everyone discovers who they're talking to. Comment where you can, and don't forget to register. My name is Melanie Sinclair, and I'm 46 years old. I stood on the edge of the reception for most of the wedding, sipping wine. I've become an expert on edges. 3 years ago, I didn't even know where the edge of a room was because I was always in the middle of it. I was often in a leadership position, helping everyone before they even began. I managed the strategies of companies whose names I knew. I built a career that became a case study. And I did all this without being a wealthy father, happily married, or in a stable relationship. They were independent, and they would call me back whenever anyone wanted to contact me. I was now the woman standing at the vanity, watching my son Ethan laugh with his new wife. I felt a strange peace, the peace of someone who had lost everything and survived. When Ethan smiled, he looked so much like my mother. No one at the reception noticed. No one knows who saw me sitting by the hospital bed for 2 years, nor who read the diary that contained everything those 2 years had quietly erased from my life. To them, I was Sandra's sister, unemployed, as gentle as a sad animal. I made them think so. I learned that contempt is a kind of silence. But the initial payment was a loan, not a gift, and there's always someone who comes along and asks for it. The call came on a Tuesday, 3 years before the wedding, and I remember it well, because I was standing in a glass-walled meeting room on the 40th floor, when my phone rang with my mother's name. I was just days away from being appointed a managing partner. I waited 20 years for that door, and finally it opened. I went out to answer the phone, feeling a little uneasy. My mother said the word, pancreas, then, 4th floor, and there was a profound silence in the 40 floors below me. She was 68 years old. The doctors had told her numbers, and they were small numbers. I did nothing in that corridor except the calculations that were important to me, while the city stretched out before me. I could open the door or control the time. It wasn't as noisy as people expected. I went back to the room and told the partners I was withdrawing my name and watched them merge into another entity for 20 years. Sandra was in another city at the time, and I called her that night. My sister quickly and calmly told me something over the phone that I hadn't understood for 3 years. When I finally understood it, I understood everything else about her. But soon a table was brought in with white flowers, and someone placed a glass down. That night, I heard the words and ignored them. Here's what people misunderstood about me and my sister. We were interrogated. When it became clear that our mother couldn't stay alone, the family held a meeting via loudspeaker, and many of us spoke. One of them spoke so clearly that one of us had to back down. Sandra was a mid-level manager at the time, and she was afraid of being isolated when working with people in similar positions. When the question was raised, she said, "I can't abandon everything I've built." And, as she had done before, she quickly added that we needed to hear the support before the rejection. The bitter truth is, I understood her. I had abandoned everything I'd built. I knew the weight of the responsibility. Sandra wasn't a cartoon character. She was a woman who climbed a long ladder in the rain and never gave up on any sport. That's when I said, "I'll do it." I said she would do something no one else dared to do, half out of pride and half out of love, without yet realizing that the world is full of 2 different books. One for those who stayed, and one for those who left. To be honest, I didn't blame her then. The resentment came later, and it didn't stem from the care itself, but from what she perceived as care. 2 years is a long time in the context of addiction treatment programs. I learned the language of oncology in the same way I learned the language of integration. Fluently and eagerly, I sold my apartment and moved to a smaller place, so I could have more appointments. I would go to appointments at 6 in the morning, and I discovered which ones were quiet and which ones were fast-paced. One time, my phone stopped working after it had been ringing all day with people who needed my opinion. Among other things, I didn't have the energy to grieve over this. Some nights, my mother would wake up from her drug-induced stupor and look at me with perfect clarity. One night, she said something I've carried in my pocket like a rock ever since. She took my hand and said, "They're going to measure you in the room you live in. Don't blame yourself the same way." I told her she was exaggerating. She said she was dying and deserved it. We both laughed. It was real laughter, not the kind of forced laughter. The last week was good. There's a blessing in not knowing which week is the last until it's over. My mother died in the spring. Something strange happened at her funeral. Last time, people started talking about me. Not her but me. My aunt patted my arm and said, "It's sad that I'm leaving, isn't it? How did you surprise me?" Sandra came in for 2 days, dressed in a stylish black gown, weeping in a way that eased the sadness of many. By the end of the reception, she had become a grieving girl, and I a wary wife trying to sort things out. I told my cousin she was very worried about me and hoped I would recover once I was off the road, instead of being a burden on our mother until her last days. I stood in my mother's kitchen, holding a tray of bread someone had brought me. It felt as though the story of the past 2 years was being silently rewritten by people who weren't even there. This is something no one warns you about. When you abandon the outward appearance of life, those around you have the opportunity to speak of the value of your hidden existence. Sandra was crafting an image for herself, and that image didn't portray me as a hero. I took that as a warning. A year passed. I prepared the death certificate, which was a task in itself, and I didn't allow myself to feel much. I gradually began to sleep again. Then Ethan called to tell me the best news I'd heard in years. He was getting married. He'd met Claire. She was kind and assertive, and it was clear she was treating him well. When he asked me to be there, I felt a joy I hadn't felt in ages. But as the call ended, my son fell silent. Then he said something that made my position perfectly clear. He said, "Mom, Aunt Sandra will be there, and she knows, you know all about being in the thick of it, and I can't live with him. He only has 1 day for me." He was scared when he saw a scene from his wedding when he was 24, and I realized then that he loved me, but he was too embarrassed to ask me at that moment. I said, "Of course, my dear, of course." And that was the end of it. It cost me something I haven't mentioned yet. Because in that short sentence, he told me which of my daughter's sisters was in trouble. Not the woman he was mocking, but the woman he wanted to mock. I hung up and sat in silence for a long time. Then I asked him another question in a quiet voice. "Where does he work now?" "This company he's so proud of." He said the name doesn't matter, Meridian Strategies Group. I lowered my voice and told him it was a good company. He said, "Yes, my Aunt Sandra helped him get the interview. She was a manager there, and he was just an analyst, but he learned a lot." I told him I was proud of him. I didn't tell him what the name meant to me because I know Meridian. I've competed with Meridian for 10 years. I've won some bids and lost others. Years ago, I developed a framework for designing sound decisions for a company in this sector. Good decisions that aren't attributed to anyone and can be applied anywhere. From what I've heard, Meridian Publishing House received a large number of copies of this book, but the instrument has become so popular now that no one remembers it has an author. Sandra spent her entire career there without ever having any reason to know who the author was. Especially my sister, who never wanted to invite me out. My son was working in a house surrounded by my sister, in a world I controlled, and then I went out, and none of them knew, because they never asked me a single real question about who I was. I could have told Ethan that night. "I want you to understand that I chose not to. That wasn't out of your plan. I'm sick of that woman's excuses. Tell them, or they won't understand." I was going to a wedding to see how happy my son was, and I didn't pay anyone for my training. The rehearsal dinner was on a Friday. Claire's family were well off. What a quiet man! And the rehearsal dinner was in a private room at a restaurant. When you go to the bathroom, the waiters fold your napkins. I was wearing a stylish dress from my previous life, and felt like an antique. Claire's parents were so kind to those who didn't know how to handle you. My sister Sandra also entered the room, just as I had arranged. She smelled of success. She was wearing a new watch and exuded renewed confidence. 10 minutes later, she was standing in a small field, looking out the window, telling a story that seemed utterly real. I watched my daughter look at her with envy, and I understood the tone of the night before. Sandra was a family success story that night, and every story was worth comparing to her. I bought a glass of wine and sat by the ledge. Now I felt like I was enjoying the view, not being persecuted. You can see everything from the ledge. You can tell the truth about anyone from the ledge, when you think important people are watching. Sandra spent the whole night watching the door, waiting for someone more important than us to arrive. The person Sandra was expecting didn't attend the rehearsal dinner, but his name came up in almost every sentence. My CEO, she kept saying. David was very particular. She told him a long story about her presentation, how strict he was, how he once refused to accept an entire presentation, and how she spent the whole night trying to fix it and convince him. She called him by name, as some people address the Pope. David? David Mercer. She dropped the note in front of Claire's father. He nodded politely. She dropped it in front of my daughter, who was smiling, because her aunt had been so close to this great man. I found myself looking at myself and realizing the difference between a woman who told David Mercer about this and a woman who told no one. I drank my wine without saying a word. The name was still a mystery to me. I'd left the industry before Mercer reached the top, and I'd never met him. But Sandra didn't know that either. All she knew about me was that I was a person, and now she knew I was nothing. She wanted to hear the real me, to see how far I'd come. She needed an audience to show off. She had no idea she was about to get one. Claire's mother politely asked me about the authorities. And what do you do, Melanie? Simple question, human. I opened my mouth to retract the advice and say that I was thinking about what would come next, honestly. And that's true and not embarrassing. But Sandra answered before I could say a word. She laughed a little and said gently, "Oh, Mel's busy right now. She's been busy for a while." She spoke gently. That was the wonderful thing about it. She turned the knife gently so as not to appear friendly, because anyone who turned would back. Claire's mother smiled hesitantly as she began to speak, and as I sat there, I realized I was just as lost in the middle of everything happening with my daughter's new family as I had been in the hallway. It was as if the 2 years I had spent holding the hand of a deceased woman had been nothing more than a gap in my life's journey, not the happiest moments of my life. The room reserved for professionals, the one nestled amidst the tense boardrooms, was eerily quiet and cold. "That's one way of saying Sandra," I said. Since the weekend was Ethan's, I let it slide. I'd promised him I wouldn't, but I kept my word. I held back a few words. I stepped out into the hall to catch my breath, and Claire followed me. My daughter got married in the usual way. She was the type to notice silence. She stood beside me in the cold air, and didn't immediately notice the silence that revealed so much about her. Then she said, "Ethan told me you looked after your mother for years. It must have been very difficult. And that's all there is to it. That's all." Instead of taking advantage of the empty space around me, she asked me about my real life. I told her a little. I told her about the 6-hour car trips, the nice nurses, and the good last week. She listened as if it was worth listening to. At one point she said, "It's okay, you know. This is strange." I had to look away from the lamp for a while. "It's odd that your daughter-in-law is the first person to show you a part of yourself in 3 years. Sandra was in the middle of the story when we went back inside, and Claire glanced across the room, a subtle expression on her face saying, "I see that too. Now I have a partner." I didn't know how much I needed it, or how often I would use it. I felt like I was crying while eating a delicious meal, and that happened on paper. Claire's father later mentioned casually that he was looking for consulting services for his company. It wasn't serious, just a passing thought. Sandra moved like a shark, sniffing the changing water. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her business cards, the Meridian Strategy collection written in dark blue ink, her name and title in elegant letters. She spread them out on the tablecloth like a deck of cards, smiled, and handed them to Claire's father. Then she turned to me. She made him sit for so long that everyone at the table fell silent, then asked, "Do you have any business cards?" "None." Silence fell over the table. Everyone understood that the question wasn't about business cards, but about whether I owned any, and I didn't have any. 3 years ago, I'd left my old cards in a drawer with the rest of my belongings, and I hadn't made any new ones because I didn't know what they were supposed to say. And so, I sat there empty-handed, in front of my son and his new family. My little sister's blue cards were spread out on the fabric as proof of who was real and who wasn't. I smiled and said no. I'd run out of cards. Sandra returned smiling, content, the sweets arrived, and everyone's time was up except mine. I carried those fan cards with me all the way to the reception. If you've ever stood in an empty room, while someone handed out little cards like they were a trump card, you know exactly what that silence feels like. Tell me in the comments. Are you smiling too? Keep going, it's normal. That night, in my tiny apartment, I did something I hadn't done in ages. I pulled a box from the top of the cabinet. No documents, no old contracts, nothing to wave at Sandra, just a photograph. It was a picture of me and my mother at an industry conference 15 years earlier. We were laughing about something outside the hall. She rushed over to me, wearing a badge and a jacket, giving a keynote speech that I didn't say a word about. She always did that. She would sit at the back of the room where her son was a professional, and she would shine. I sat on the floor of my apartment, looking at that picture, and asked myself the question I had been asking myself for 3 years. If I don't contribute anything, what am I? If no one has reached my level, am I still considered? It's a disgusting question to ask yourself. This meant I was beginning to believe Sandra's accounts, the world's accounts, the accounts of a woman without a title, a woman without value. I didn't intend to cry over it. I looked at the picture and let the question speak for itself, because you can't fix a corruption you don't want to name. My mother's voice reached me from the beautiful week that had passed. Don't measure yourself by the same standards. I put the picture in my bag. I don't know why. I just wanted it for the wedding. On the morning of the wedding, Ethan needed help tying his tie. He always did. He came to me in the small room next to the church in the vineyard, the ends of his tie dangling, and that helpless look on his face that he'd had since he was 6. I jumped up and tied the knot, just as my father had taught me. His hands were trembling slightly. I was scared. I straightened the collar and looked at my son in his wool suit. He had to breathe carefully. He looked in the mirror. We thought about it together. For a moment, a hint of sadness crossed his face. "Mom, tell me what I asked Aunt Sandra on the phone. It wasn't fair." "I know it wasn't." I said it's okay. She was arguing and I didn't want to, so I stopped her. "Honey, it's your day and I'm not going to make a fuss about it. It's a promise from me, and I mean it as a gift, not a sacrifice." He clung to me tightly, like a small child frightened by thunder. Over his shoulder, I saw the vineyard by the window, the white chairs, the people coming. I promised him peace, and I intended to keep that promise. What I didn't yet know was that peace could not be mine, nor could it be broken. Another man held the pin. The ceremony was beautiful and brief, that's how it usually is. Then came the reception. They entered a long, open-sided hall covered in vines. Its columns rose and glowed dimly in the darkness. They seated me at a table with my great-aunt and 2 of Claire's friends from university. And then I understood. The reception desks were reserved for those arriving that day. From that moment on, I kept an eye on my sister in the room. I particularly noticed an elderly man in his mid-50s wandering among the temples, not wearing silver robes, but a cloak. People of real influence are quiet, because they don't occupy too much space. Sandra stayed with him all night. She kept refilling her glass. She laughed for a moment at everything he said. Even from behind me, I could see that David, the CEO, was an angel, his name like perfume. That Ethan had come to my daughter's wedding, because he was one of the young analysts. And that Sandra had decided tonight was her chance. I didn't know him. All I knew about the party was that I'd been the one to prepare a room for him beforehand. And I knew what it felt like to want to be well looked after. I took a sip of my wine. My glass was warm again, and then Sandra looked across the hall, saw me sitting at my small table at the back, and started pulling the man away. I knew what was going to happen, the weather. Sandra crossed the hall and brought David Mercer into my office, her arm around him, and I realized I was going to use him as a decoration. She wanted to show her CEO how kind she was, how she'd helped the poor from work to her sister, and how far she'd come from her background. Some people build themselves up. Sandra had always learned to build herself up by relying on others. And tonight, I was the one attending the wedding of the person who had been most important in her professional life. I put down my glass. I kept my back straight, just as I had before entering the opposing team's meeting room. These people were like ancient muscle memory, revealing a life I had never imagined. Claire saw the way across the room and began to move, despite the considerable distance. My daughter was laughing unconsciously at the table. Sandra approached my table with a bright smile, gesturing to me with an open hand like a hostess, expressing her curiosity. Then she took a breath and turned to the quiet, silver-haired man sitting beside her. I looked up at them and waited. Sometimes you hear the sound of them falling before they actually do. This was one of those times. My sister opened her mouth, confident in the ground beneath her, confident in who mattered in that room and who didn't. Sandra said clearly, "David, this is my sister I told you about. Melanie, the unemployed one. Lives with her family. She's been through tough times for years. God bless her." She said this to one of the executives at her sister's wedding, smiling warmly. My cousin, who was sitting next to me, gasped. One of Claire's friends looked down at her plate, and I did what I'd learned to do over 3 years with absent people. I laughed. Not a bitter laugh, just a soft one. Then I looked at the man, David, and said the truth in a low voice, even as I spoke, and closed the door behind me. I told him she was right. I had no more glass. I think I meant it as a surrender the first time. I meant, "Sandra, I'm going to win." I finished the story, but some sentences just linger in your mouth as you speak them. As soon as I said them, it felt like they were no longer excuses. I no longer had a topic, as if a topic had suddenly taken me by surprise. My mother's voice slipped through the words, and the quiet man sat still at the table, placing his glass slowly and deliberately on the cloth, looking at me as if I hadn't seen him in 3 years, as if I were someone worthy of attention. "Excuse me," the man said, completely ignoring my sister. "I don't think we've had a proper meeting." Then, in a quiet, low voice, he asked me, "What's your name?" Something had changed. There was a note of interest in his tone that hadn't been there before. "Melanie," I said. Sandra stepped in to fill the void, unable to remain silent. "Sinclair, she's Sinclair, just like me, of course," she added, then laughed again, eager to steer the conversation back on track. The man's eyes never left mine. "Melanie Sinclair," he repeated quietly, and I saw something emerge from behind his eyes. A file being pulled from a deep shelf. Melanie isn't Sinclair, and she didn't make the decision. Her great-aunt looked confused. Sandra's smile began to fade, because she hadn't expected to hear those words from her younger sister in years. I felt my heart pounding in my ears. I said it cautiously. "And I wrote it down, yes, a long time ago." Then the man, David Mercer, CEO of Meridian Strategic Group, the company my sister was so afraid of leaving, gave a short, sudden sigh, almost a laugh, shook his head slowly and said, "A long time ago. The entire analytics department has been with you for a long time?" There was complete silence at the table. Sandra's hand touched the back of the chair. He spoke simply, which only made her feel worse. He said that Meridian had adopted his organizational methodology within the company years ago as the cornerstone of their decision-making process. He added that 3 years ago, when he became CEO, she was the first woman he wanted to hire from outside the company. "In every hiring cycle over the past 3 years, my team put your name at the top of the list, and I tried again. But you vanished completely. No trace of you in any organization, no board seat, nothing. I thought you'd been buried in a neutrality agreement, or threatened by someone who'd gone abroad to compete." He shook his head. "I don't understand how someone so kind could be lost. Similarly, my mother was ill. I went to take care of her. She died last year." The words reached a guard in that quiet corridor, where even Sandra couldn't speak. David Mercer looked at me for a long moment and said, "So you're looking into every organization in the country, and I have a team. Where exactly were you?" I asked him. "At the hospital, then at the funeral, then to find out what would happen next," he replied. He nodded slowly, and something on his face shifted from professional interest to something that seemed to be respect. Beside him, my sister's pale expression, which had preceded the story she had been telling for years, was reduced to a single sentence. My sister had a choice at that moment, and I want to be fair to her, because in that situation, she was back on track. She could have said, "I'm so proud of my sister. Look what she's achieved so far." She could have made the truth look like a wonderful relative again. But Sandra had been searching for my daughter for so many years that she couldn't put down the shears. Even if the land was destroyed, she laughed nervously and said, "Well, that was a long time ago, David. She's not in that business anymore. She left years ago. You know how it is. The farm goes on." She said it to humiliate me, as if she could berate me like a wasp. But after introducing the CEO to the woman she described as unemployed and a failure living with her family, she told him about the woman she described as the backbone of the organization at a wedding. I watched as David Mercer slowly turned his head to look at my sister. He looked at her intently. The way you look at a document you're reading for the second time, the way you see what you've lost. The heat didn't add anger to his face, but something cold and decisive. He set down the drink he'd been carefully refilling all night, and the whole room held its breath. Forks hung low, lights flickered, and all the nearby tables were now clearly visible. "Sandra," David Mercer said softly. So softly, in fact, that people leaned forward without realizing it. "I've heard you talking about your colleagues in the office before. I told myself it was all just fantasies. Over-the-top behavior. I gave you space." He paused. "But I saw you introduce your sister, the woman to whom our entire company owes money, as unemployed and a failure at her own daughter's wedding." He let him sit. "He'll tell me everything I need to know and everything I don't." Sandra started calling him by name. "Please, David." He finally raised his hand, rather rudely. "This isn't the place, and neither am I. But HR is meeting Monday morning. And I think you know why." She said she would write down the time. No shouting, no theatrics. The most powerful person in the room finished speaking quietly. Not because I was clever, but because she was resolute, and there was a difference, and everyone at that table felt it. Sandra made a sound I had never heard from her before, faint and melancholic. And that surprised me. I didn't feel the rush I expected, nor the warm, clear outpouring of justice. I saw my sister's face crumble before Claire's family and my son. And what stirred within me was harsh and strange. Because a single, calm sentence had unmasked a woman who thought that a certain subject would make her immune. As I watched her, I realized I didn't want her in her unfinished state. I was searching for something else, and I still hadn't found the right words to say to her. The table was set quietly like a wedding table. Whispers, sliding chairs, and someone hurrying to meet Ethan. My son's eyes widened as he tried to understand how the wedding had ended like this, between his aunt, his mother, and his boss. Claire reached me first. She walked around the table and stood beside my chair, placing her hand on my shoulder. A young woman who had sat next to a family member for years, as if she were a piece of furniture. I will love her for that reason until I die. My sister Sandra, her legs aching, sat in a nearby chair. She didn't get angry for a moment. She didn't take any action. She looked at me from behind the rubble she had created herself. Something naked was visible on her face, and she almost said to herself, "You're the one they'll always remember." The words came out of her as if she had kept something bottled up for 40 years. "You're the one they'll always remember." And in that single sentence, I finally understood what she had said over the phone 3 years earlier. Something I had been unable to translate. She had refused to care for our mother because she lacked compassion. She had refused because she was afraid that if she left her brightly lit room, even briefly, the world would forget she existed. As she believed, she had always been adept at understanding me. Her harshness wasn't strength. When this woman said she was sticking to her sport in the rain, she was certain that giving up meant losing. I stood up. I think they were all waiting for me to say something to Sandra, one last sentence to reinforce a point she'd been making for ages. I didn't. Instead, I turned to David Mercer and asked if I could say a word, and we walked a short distance from the table, past a column covered in wine and candles. The closer we got, the quieter it became. A man began rearranging the rooms around him. "It was wonderful," he said. I gave him what I had built and what I owed him, then gently stopped him. "Mr. Mercer," I said, "I have to ask you something. It seems strange." "Wait, don't fire my sister." He tilted his head. I said, "If your company has crossed the line, that's your business, and you have to do what your job requires. But I want to know that this is not a privilege being handed to me. I've been targeted for 3 years by others, and I'm not going to start a new chapter of my life by having a woman destroy me in my place. This isn't a victory I'm striving for. It's been a long time since I studied the way one studies what one cannot achieve. And I realized, as I said, that I'm not just talking about Sandra. I want the world to give me things from now on, whether they be insults or rewards, and I will be in control." I felt a complete stillness in my body. I began to transform into someone I had never seen before. David Mercer was silent for a moment, then smiled a genuine smile. It was the first time I had ever seen him. He said, "You are the person I have been searching for 3 years. Now I understand why I couldn't find you. People like you don't just leave a trace, you leave a legacy." Then it turned into a business model. He continued speaking seriously. He wanted me at Meridian, not as a consultant, but in a senior leadership position, responsible for the company's overall strategy. He mentioned I had a salary, and it was a substantial amount, so that important phone call still made a splash. He said he would inform Meridian, but I wanted him to personally confirm that the entertainment industry was aware of Melanie Sinclair's return. This needed to be documented in a press release. He would return everything that had been secretly taken from him over the past 3 years by the afternoon. Then he reached for his jacket to pack it, took out his business cards, thick paper, his name and title, and placed them on a small table between us. A card for me to take. A man placed the best piece of paper in front of me all weekend and, as usual, asked me to return to normal. I looked at him and felt as though I had been focused all night, for 3 years, on that small piece of paper, and the choice he was asking me to make. I want to tell you I hadn't thought about it. That would be a lie, and that story was enough. I took it seriously. Everything I'd longed for 3 years had been reduced to that piece of paper inside me. Take it, that part of me told me. Take the title. Take the salary. Take the press release. Go back to your old life, okay? The entire industry that witnessed your disappearance and triumphant return. Sandra read about it. It was a victory by every measure I'd used for 20 years. A door I never opened again. And this time no one died. This time I could only say yes. Claire's father would meet his advisor. My daughter would have a mother with a title again. And her great-grandmother would improve her strained past tense sentences. At the start of that weekend, everything I could wish for was on a small, rectangular cocktail table. But wanting something and needing it are 2 different things. My mother had taught me how to read records. Because if I accepted that card, I would be a woman whose worth was imported, bestowed by an influential man, printed on paper I hadn't chosen, and returned to me on paper bearing someone else's logo. Just as Sandra had measured reality, I would return to reality. I would win her game. Whoever wins the other's game agrees to play again. I looked at the card and understood what she was saying clearly, just as my mother's week had been good last week. You were measuring yourself the same way. Finally, I understood what she was trying to tell me. This is what 2 years spent at a patient's bedside in a hospital taught me. Even if I only read it on a business card at a wedding reception, I came to believe that the value of my life lies in the value I bring to others. Build a foundation, close the deal, manage the situation well, and you'll find that the applause you receive is well worth it. Stop producing, and you'll find yourself in the thick of it. That was the equation, the same equation Sandra lived by. The same equation that drove her to betray our mother. The same equation that made her carry naval IDs like a lifeboat. On the floor of my apartment, An old photograph convinced me that a woman without a title is a woman without value. But I accomplished the most important thing I could in a room devoid of applause. I sat with my mother for 2 years, without anyone applauding her, without anyone thanking her, without anyone including it in my resume. There was no emptiness. It was a complete and genuine work of my life. The world called those years emptiness. The world was wrong. I thought the world was mine. My mother saw it coming. Don't measure yourself by the same standards. She didn't tell me to build a room bigger than Sandra's. She told me to make the room the size I wanted. I looked up from the map and saw David Mercer. For the first time in 3 years, I knew my true worth from the start, that I was more than just a printed name. I picked up David Mercer's card and held it for a moment, so he could make sure I fully understood what I was dealing with. Then I put it back and gently handed it to him on the table. I said, "Thank you." And I meant it sincerely. You don't know what it means to have your name mentioned. You saw my own family decide I'm an example to others. I'll bear it. Skilled negotiators know when something else will come along, so they wait. But I won't be taking this position, and that's not boasting. I chose my words carefully, as I used to in board meetings, but now they're my words alone. You offered to fix me, to set things right, to put me back in the place I was. But David, I haven't lost my mind. I haven't gone astray. I've simply forgotten how to see this room, and it wasn't a failure I could fix just by getting a better chair. I don't need fixing it. I have to make my own table, and I want the first question to be, "Whom did you look after?" Instead of, "What's your name?" He was silent for a long time. Then David Mercer, CEO of Meridian Strategic Group, did something that has always impressed me. He chuckled, picked up the card, put it back, and said, "Melanie, there are many people vying for this position. In 30 years, you're the first person I'm giving it to. You're the one who chooses to build this place." He held out his hand. "Then I'll be your first client. And don't fire your sister Melanie. You said you heard me. Sandra, what I'm doing is for my company, not for you. Just as you asked. That's the difference between you two." I shook his hand. I went into that party with nothing to offer anyone, and I came out with everything rejected, and I've never felt so rich in my life. I went to look for my son. Ethan was standing by the cake with Claire, looking like a child whose beautiful day had been abruptly cut short. His face held 1,000 questions at once when he saw me. I took both his hands in mine. I told him that the wedding was still perfect, that nothing that had happened at that table meant anything to him, and that his mother was better than she had been 3 years ago, which was true. He asked me quietly if it was frightening. "No, darling," I replied. "I think quite the opposite. I think it was the night your mother turned herself in to the police." Claire hugged me and glanced over her shoulder, into the hallway where Sandra sat alone at an empty table. Her dark blue glasses were blank, she wasn't looking at anything. I didn't go to her. There was no fixing that night. Maybe there wasn't even a night, and I made peace with it. But she caught my eye in the room, and I wasn't happy. I didn't even notice. I shook my head slightly. "Sorry, not exactly. Thanks." Two sisters who grew up in the same house, who followed the same rules about who was important, and only one of us got away with it. She turned her face away at first. Then I returned to my son and his wife, drank a glass of wine, and let the wedding celebration continue as usual throughout the night. Later, when the dancing had begun and no one needed me anymore, I left the hall and stood for a while in the dimness of the vineyard, listening to the music coming from behind me. My mother's picture was in my bag. I took it out and looked at it under the decorative lights. We laughed together about that conference that had taken place so long ago, and I calmly told her that I finally understood what she had wanted to give me, and I apologized for being late. For 3 years, I had been stumbling out of class, feeling as though the hidden mathematics was weighing me down little by little each time. That night, I left the room, and for the first time since her death, I felt a sense of belonging. I had no title, no identity card. I had renounced wealth and power, and stood in the darkness with a photograph of a dead woman in my hand, detached from the events. I was finally on the cusp of starting my own project. The music was playing, the lights were flashing, and behind me my son was dancing with his wife, and my sister was gathering her coat. The world hadn't changed one iota. I still judged everyone by the room they stood in, but I had changed completely, and that was the only measure I had to adjust. That was just over a year ago. Here's what happened, because I know you all want to know. I arranged what I told you about David. Sinclair's strategy is deliberately simple: 3 people and a few clients. David Mercer kept his word and opened doors for me that I wouldn't have had to knock on twice. It's not an empire, and I don't want one. I've created a version of my life that strives for resounding success, and I'm not going back. The organization is enough. It's mine, and it measures things correctly. Sandra Meridian left on Monday. The field is small, people are talking, and her story has followed her for a while, so she joined a small company in another city. The risks are minimal, but she's still stuck. We're not close. I've stopped pretending. Some fractures don't heal into something solid, they only heal to stop the bleeding. And you learn to live with the scars. The world's calculations haven't changed. It still worships that title and calls the years of caregiving a gap. I couldn't fix it, so I stopped trying, but Ethan and Claire come over for dinner regularly now. Claire is pregnant, and my son in my arms is someone who fully understands his mother's worth. These are the results, not a myth, but a reality. The 3 years I spent learning how to cope with emptiness were my greatest accomplishments. A person's worth isn't something that can be measured out on a card laid out on a table. Last week, I interviewed a woman at my company who had been unemployed for 3 years to care for her father. Her hands were trembling as she reached for the blank section of her resume, ready for the usual question. I didn't ask her about that section. Instead, I asked her to tell me about her father. She started to cry, then began to speak. I knew then that I would hire her before she had even finished. A card, a laugh, a quiet man lowering his glass. If there's a quiet woman in your life who hides a lot that others don't see, tell her today. Subscribe to the Quiet Drama Stories podcast and see you in the next episode.